Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the last of the Abbasi program's series of panels expanding awareness and understanding about the current situation in Palestine. My name is Nora Barakat. I teach modern Middle East history here at Stanford. And I want to start by acknowledging that Stanford sits on the ancestral land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. This land was and continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. Consistent with our values of community and inclusion, we have a responsibility to acknowledge, honor, make visible, and especially in the spirit of today's panel, to advocate for a constructive relationship between the university and Native peoples. I'm going to start by thanking a few people. I want to thank Lisa Blades, the director of the Abbasi program, for her support for this initiative and for moderating the panel yesterday, the second in this series. I also want to thank Alexander Key for his organizing and moderating work, as well as the other faculty affiliates who've been involved in organizing this series of panels. I especially want to thank Colin Hamill and Lolita Duperon of the Abbasi program for their organizing, technical work, and much, much more. The recording of the first panel in our series is now available on the Abbasi program's YouTube channel. So before I introduce our panelists today, I want to take a moment just to acknowledge the intellectual and emotional labor of Palestinian scholars across Palestine and in the diaspora over the past months. They have been participating in countless webinars, Zoom discussions, and other educational events that have made the ongoing violence and dispossession visible to a very wide audience around the world, including through panels like this series. I'm going to start by introducing our panelists today. First to speak is going to be Muna Dajani. Muna recently received her Ph.D. in Geography and Environment from the London School of Economics. Her research examines the distinctive livelihood practices by which farming acquires political subjectivity, especially in the occupied Golan Heights. She examines the role of sumud, or steadfastness, of staying on the land as a form of cultural resistance. Muna has worked in wide fields of environment and development in Palestine for over a decade. She works with grassroots initiatives, with NGOs, and with governmental bodies on many different kinds of projects. And it's wonderful that she's here with us today. Thank you, Muna, for joining us. I'm also going to introduce Basma Fahoum. Basma is a PhD candidate in the history department here at Stanford. Her dissertation focuses on the history of tobacco cultivation in Palestine in the late Ottoman and British mandatory periods. Basma is currently in Jaffa and unfortunately won't be able to join us live today, but after Muna speaks, my colleague Alexander Key will read some thoughts and analysis from Basma about the current situation, especially in Jaffa. Muna will respond to those thoughts before taking questions from the wider audience. We are going to keep our session to 60 minutes today, so if you have questions, please ask them when the Q&A begins. As a member of the history faculty, I want to especially acknowledge Basma Fahoum's service to the department. She was teaching remotely while under siege in Jaffa during this spring quarter. This is a commitment to her students that goes above and beyond the already draining pandemic experience that we've all been in with research and teaching over the past year. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Muna Dajani for her remarks.
Thank you so much, Nora, for this great introduction. And I also want to extend my thanks to everyone at the Abbasi program, Islamic Study at Stanford, for the generous invitation and for providing the space through this series of panels for us to amplify the voices, experiences, and scholarship of Palestinians and people who work on Palestine within a critical and open lens. I really wanted to take advantage of joining this panel today to speak a bit about more personal and scholarly reflection on my work on water justice and water politics in Palestine and in the wider Bilad al-Sham. And I also wanted to kind of provide a link between the great speakers who spoke yesterday and also last week, and hopefully it will allow a bit of continuity as well in the discussion. So I wanted to kind of pose a question to start with: is how do we link the events that have been happening in the past few weeks to this systematic and multi-layered injustice inflicted on the Palestinians by the Israeli settler colonial regime? We have heard so much about kind of what we heard a lot about the phrase "from the river to the sea," and kind of this feeling and this experience of feeling united after years of and decades of fragmentation and disenfranchisement, political and geographical displacement from each other as Palestinians from the river to the sea. But what we have seen as well is from the river to the sea also reflects the characteristics of the settler colonial states. And while it aims to divide and rule over Palestinians within those geographical divides, there is the ongoing dispossession that people in that region face on a daily basis that also unifies and kind of makes the fragmentation that the settler colonial state tried for so long to enforce a myth. So why is it personal for me? Of course, being a Palestinian from Jerusalem, but also that one of the houses that's facing expulsion come August is my grandparents' house in Sheikh Jarrah, and it's the house where we grew up in, and we have grown up knowing that this house has provided refuge for my family after years of being made refugees and having to travel to Syria and Jordan, then at the end come back to Jerusalem, the place where my grandparents are from Baqa, the west, what became to be known as West Jerusalem. But finding refuge in Sheikh Jarrah. And this is the story not only of my grandparents, of course, but the story of hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, those who are still dreaming of the day to come back, but also for Palestinians themselves who are inside that region from the river to the sea, who are being still dispossessed of that right to re-establish roots and to make a connection. We speak of it as an ongoing Nakba because as much as the structure of settler colonialism is still expanding and finding new ways to dispossess, we also experience it on a daily basis. And what I see is happening in Sheikh Jarrah that can be also mirrored in a lot of places, as we will see from Basma's intervention, and also what we've heard from the panelists, what we know, what we've heard in testimonies, that why was Sheikh Jarrah such a powerful microcosm? Because it really characterizes this quest of settler colonial regimes to eliminate connection, rootedness between people and their natural space and the environment that they live in, and to really, at the end of the day, to stop a Palestinian presence on the land, to eliminate that presence and overshadow it with a settler colonial presence. And it's an everyday violence that manifests itself in multiple ways. When I do look at, when I work on issues relating to water, I'm really interested as well as in infrastructure that the settler colonial state develops, constructs, and uses to not only create facts on the ground and maintain territorial sovereignty, but kind of also the embodied and the meanings and values behind that, the ideological drive for such infrastructures to be in place. But I'm also interested in the infrastructural violence. And this can be seen in multiple ways, especially when it comes to Palestinian livelihoods and presence on the land. There's multiple levels of violence that are inflicted upon them. While we can see a violence that is against the Palestinian presence and the Palestinian infrastructure, whether it is a material infrastructure like water networks, water treatment plants, pipe networks in areas in the West Bank, for instance. They also target social infrastructure, our cultural organizations and our political entities and our social cooperatives and all sorts of infrastructure that we have developed throughout the decades to counter the settler colonial dispossession. But also the settler colonial state also works on another type of violence that's against what is known to be nature, the indigenous nature. So the fact that it looks at like the ecosystems that the indigenous have for thousands of years have catered for and have adapted it to suit the needs and the limits of the environment around them, we see it being attacked. The colonial, let's say, imaginary and legacy has been to actually subdue nature, to ensure that nature is harnessed, that nature is put to use. It's made to be exploited to its optimal levels, and beyond that, reaching over exploitation in order to cater for the needs of the settler colonial states, which is mainly total control of land and water, and also control of the landscapes. And I also speak about, this violence against imaginaries, and the fact that that the settler colonial state enforces a dominant viewpoint and imaginary of places and landscapes, and denies Palestinian sovereignty and their right to resourcehood as well. And when I really think of water and work with water, we understand that the settler colonial state sees water as a resource to be exploited. As I mentioned, it's H2O. The more we have of it, the better. If we're able to also produce new types of water to further control this resource and further maintain territorial hegemony, this is the settler logic. It's a very, very masculinized discourse, and it's a discourse of territorial control. But however, we know that water is imbued with the multiplicity of characteristics as well. It comes with a multiplicity of meanings, of values, it offers us windows into different worldviews and different ways of making sense of our place in the world. One of the important things that water scholarship in indigenous studies have brought to the table of critical political ecology and other critical discourses in geography is that water is what we make of it. Water is what we give more emphasis to. And so far, we know that colonial legacy and settler colonial regime in Palestine, Israel, has really emphasized the fact that water is a resource to be exploited and to be overly depleted. But we know that water means so much more than that. So that's where kind of my interest in water comes in. But what is important about water is also it provides us avenues to think about how communities, especially Palestinian communities, in the wake of the Nakba after 1948, have after losing their means of production and their livelihoods, how did they make sense of this dismembered reality that they have come across after the 1948? So this is where I kind of investigated how water and reclaiming rights to water is actually imbued with reclaiming rights to political identity and belonging to the land. But again, where do we start in our attempt to trace the systematic exclusion of Palestinians from their natural resources? Usually when we speak about water, we tend to focus on 1967 and the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, also the occupation of other Arab lands like the Syrian Golan Heights and the Egyptian Sinai. However, the Syrian Golan Heights, the West Bank, have still until today have been witnessing a reality where water is a grave injustice and inequality in water distribution and use, and also the fact that water is being used as a weapon for ethnic cleansing, to actually facilitate ethnic cleansing from certain areas of the West Bank, like the Jordan River. And why is it really a systematic injustice? Is that it has produced what we refer to as an uneven waterscape, meaning that the same geographical area with the same conditions, with the same geographical climatic conditions, where one group of people, the Israeli Jewish settlers, let's say in the West Bank, they have a certain waterscape where water is in abundance, where water is catered to them and fulfilled in its distribution to them by the Israeli state in illegal lands, while Palestinians who have been in this land for generations are not allowed to even construct a simple water network to connect their source of water to their lands. There are situations where the situation is so grave that people cannot even actually fulfill the basic needs for their own drinking, that they have to actually move to other areas in the West Bank. And this is an internal displacement that's caused by weaponizing water and using it as a tool of ethnic cleansing. But again, this is the story that we always hear. And I wanted in this talk and in my research also to kind of trace it back to its origins. Just because of time, I'll just quickly share with you a few details that even prior to 1948, under British colonial rule, Jews and Arabs were given different treatment when it came to the development of their natural resources. A lot of concessions for the development of natural resources were given to Zionist entrepreneurs and businessmen usually, and they were denied to Palestinians. Mekorot, which many of you might know as it's the Israeli water company that is a government-owned company today, has its roots in Zionist. It has Zionist roots when it was established in 1937 as a Zionist organized water company that caters to only Zionist aspirations of taking over lands, stealing lands basically from Palestinians, and developing water resources only for the benefit of these settlements. And depriving Palestinians throughout the decades, even after 1948, from equal access to water networks for drinking for Palestinian villages that remained in 1948, and for agricultural development as well. So in my research, instead of, again, being confined to thinking about water only in the West Bank in Gaza, I tried to kind of transcend those physical divides and geographical divides to think about the origin of the Palestinian plight and injustice. And this is where, like, the work in the Galilee that I did kind of really exposed to myself as a researcher, and also just in general, like exposed, that this water injustice is actually it's part of a structural of settler colonial structural policies of exclusion and deprivation of Palestinians from access to the resources and the right to resourcehood. Kyle White, who is an indigenous scholar at Michigan University, I suppose still, he talks about how this right to resourcehood does not only include the material access to natural resources, but a sense of stewardship and a responsibility towards the environment, where indigenous people also have a sense of responsibility that they pass on through generations, through traditional knowledge and local ways of understanding the world around them and the environment around them. So this sense of resourcehood is the one that also Israel has targeted systematically in its dispossession of Palestinian natural resources. So in addition to Palestinians inside Israel losing their sense of identity and community after the Nakba, they also lost access and control of their means of production. In 1961, David Ben-Gurion and his advisor on Arab affairs, his name was Uri Lubrani, said he wanted Arabs to turn into woodcutters and water carriers, basically to only be existing merely as laborers to benefit the Jewish economy that was already just developing. And there were a lot of cases that I looked into where Palestinian agricultural areas and fallahin, so the peasants that stayed inside 1948, were only seen as used for the benefit of Jewish settlement expansion, or for agricultural practices that the settlers were not able to actually cope with, like all of the hilly areas and the hilly parts of Galilee, for instance, that the settlers were not able to cultivate. They would rely on Palestinian labor to do so, but never for the benefit of them, of course. And it was all short-lived with their reliance on Palestinian labor. And only in the 60s already there was this big abandonment of agriculture inside Israel. I just wanted to share as well that today farmers inside Israel as well receive like 3.5% of water allocations for agriculture, despite constituting 20% of the population. The total agricultural land used today by Palestinians inside Israel amounts to 700,000 dunams, excluding the Naqab. For the Jews, the number is 4.2 million dunams. They receive 96.5% of the water. So Palestinians have control over 18% of the land and use 3.5% of the water. This was a testimony by an agronomist, a Palestinian agronomist in Nazareth when I did my research. So, I'm just wary of time. Let me just have a look. Okay. So I wanted to kind of really highlight with this story about Palestinian farmers inside Israel. Actually, their experience mirrors the experience of Palestinian farmers in Area C, that mirrors the experience of Palestinian farmers in Gaza. All of them are dealing with multi-layered ways of weaponizing their access to resources. We have heard a lot about how in Gaza there's a herbicide. Israel actually sprays herbicides along the border, along the firing zone, and kills hundreds of kilos of produce that Palestinians in Gaza grow. The situation also in the Gaza Strip, where we know as well that even after 1967 and within these decades, water has been overexploited in the basins in Gaza Strip. And today, more than 95% of the water is unfit for human consumption. I wanted to also highlight that today, after the Oslo Accords in the 1990s, the situation has been further complicated as well by making the water sector a sector that is in the hands of the international community, that's working together with the Palestinian Authority and Israel. The Joint Water Committee that was established from the Oslo Accords actually gave Israel even more control of the natural resources and decisions over which infrastructure makes it and is allowed to be built in the West Bank. And it kind of continuing, the hegemonic control over natural resources that started with the military rules that after 1967. So I just wanted to maybe raise a point that Sophia also talked about kind of the complicity of the Palestinian Authority and even as well the international community. What type of future are we building if we build our infrastructure in a way that only that is sanctioned by the settler colonial state? So many infrastructure that's built today, water infrastructure, follows that trend of being only approved if Israel only allows it to be built. And this is where the international community has an extensive role in kind of really creating a situation that actually makes the injustice towards Palestinians and their connection to the land even more and more, even more and more weakened. And I wanted to also kind of say that how do we get out of this situation where we see this kind of entrenched type of injustice that has been actually built in from the infrastructure below. and it's a structural type of infrastructural violence that the settler colonial state actually exercises. How do we actually think of more liberatory type of infrastructure? How can we actually think of what I refer to in my research as counter-infrastructure, where communities can take control over their natural resources and find platforms to amplify and strengthen initiatives that aim to kind of encounter and oppose the settler colonial regime. I see a lot of potential because we have a lot of great initiatives that are happening on the ground in Palestine that aim to create more sustainable forms of and more sustainable and forms of consumption and production of natural resources through the work of lots of community-supported agriculture groups. And the fact that they are happening all over Palestine, so they're not confined just to the West Bank. They're also happening in Gaza and happening inside for Palestinian communities inside 48. And this is a type of decolonial ways of looking and thinking and using infrastructure that I see happening. So I just wanted to end by saying, you know, as much as we kind of see settler colonial infrastructure being impenetrable, and the fact that the settler colonial state builds a series of an assemblage of infrastructures that kind of want to use it as a tool to terrorize and to dispossess. We also see that these structures of settler colonial infrastructures are also disintegrating. So this myth of an all-powerful and undefeatable and impermeable structures is proven yet again to be a myth, like we've seen in the last days and the last weeks. So we are making these dentures, punctures, and finding loopholes in those seemingly impermeable structures with acts of everyday resistance and in acts of imagining a more liberated and just future for Palestinians. I just wanted to end there, and I hope we can maybe generate more discussion right now with the Q&A as well.
Thank you so much, Muna. That was so helpful. And I love this idea of counter-infrastructure. I hope we can come back to that in the Q&A. I want to pass the mic over to my colleague, Alexander Key, who is going to read and discuss a little bit some of the communication that we got from Basma Fahoum from Jaffa.
Thanks, Nora. Thanks, Muna. Yeah, one of the things that Basma said to us, and I should I should reiterate what Nora said, that we're very grateful to have a member of our academic community here at Stanford who's doing her academic research in the country that she grew up in and is living in Jaffa at the moment. Basma said that one of the things that she would have liked to talk about specifically is the mixed cities inside Israel, inside the 1948 boundaries, and the underlying discrimination that ignited the civilian violence in Jaffa, Lid, Akka, and Ramli, and elsewhere. So if you think back to the discussion in the previous two panels, these are the cities inside Israel that have a combination of Palestinian Israeli citizens and Jewish Israeli citizens. There are cities that are just Palestinian Israeli citizens, like Nazareth, and then there are mixed cities, hence the term mixed cities. Basma says that what I would have wanted to say is that the notion of coexistence has always been used in Israel to mask the norm of segregation. And I should note here, just kind of moving from Basma to myself as an Anglo person living in California and somebody who lived in Israel for a number of years, I think that the mixed cities are a very powerful symbol of coexistence for a lot of Jewish Israelis, the sense that the mixed cities show a certain potential. And that use of something as a symbol is very similar to the way that the white community I live in now uses a sort of a voluntary busing transfer program from the neighboring city of East Palo Alto as a symbol of coexistence and a future of a more racially diverse California. However, it covers up the fact that my kids are in a segregated elementary school system with massive disparities in access to resources and access to power and influence. So again, that notion of a mixed area or a moment of mixing being a symbol of coexistence and there being a gap between that and the reality of segregation, I think is not specific to Israel. However, the history is very different, and I'm returning to Basma here. Basma says that the policy history that overprivileges Jewish citizens of Israel ranges from evacuations of tenants in public housing to differing attitudes to historical sites, so cemeteries and places of worship, to different funding patterns of cultural resource centers. So like a different attitude to funding cultural resource centers or religious resource centers, depending on the identity of the citizens in question. And a campaign for internal settlement of the hearts, all aiming, reading Basma, to Judaize space and further segregate Arab Palestinians from Jewish Israelis. Jews and Palestinians might live in very close proximity, but their access to services, their economic ability, and their relationship with the authorities are miles apart. She says that now, after the violence, something feels broken. Jewish Israelis have stopped coming to the less gentrified Arab parts of Jaffa, and the possibility of retaliation that's more than economic looms. Even the hummus is not enough anymore, she says, and moderate voices in Jewish society are inaudible as the political discourse becomes saturated with hatred and fear. This is Basma writing yesterday in Jaffa, which is the Palestinian city next to part of Tel Aviv. The history, and as she goes into a little bit more detail of kind of the recent history, it's what happens in these mixed cities and what doesn't get sufficiently discussed, she says, is the process of forced removal of Palestinian citizens from those mixed cities. The marriage between settler organizations that operate in the West Bank and organizations that seek to do the same thing within mixed spaces inside Israel. Often which are framed as development schemes that are part of a neoliberal economy and are part of a real estate bubble. And the real estate bubble is important. Like this is our place, both in Jerusalem and in the mixed cities and in Nazareth. Palestinian real estate is incredibly expensive and getting more expensive on a very steep graph, whilst that's not associated with any of the quote unquote benefits that one might expect to see in a gentrification process elsewhere. You know, if house prices go up in Silicon Valley, that goes along with gentrification. House prices are going up in Palestinian areas inside Israel, absent any kind of structural process of environmental improvement or gentrification. And she frames this history as being behind the anger of the Palestinian citizens of Israel, which erupted in physical violence and damage to property. And she says, in response to the mobs of citizens that mobilized across the country and were bussed into the mixed cities and protected by Israeli police, whilst chanting "Death to the Arabs." The two final things. The first of all is in the aftermath of those riots, Basma notes, and other civil society organizations like Adala also noted that the subsequent policing action after the rioting in the mixed cities and elsewhere was openly described by Israel's police as Operation Law and Order, intended to intimidate and serve as a deterrent. And the Palestinian attorneys have protested, that the Palestinian citizen of Israel attorneys have protested, that this amounts to collective punishment. If you see like a series of arrests as a deterrence to your own citizens, it constitutes collective punishment for those citizens. The second thing that Basma says, and this is where I'm going to end, is that she was protesting house evacuations in Ramadan, and that before Ramadan, so like a few months ago, and hundreds of houses were going on the market in this very hot real estate market. The inhabitants didn't own those houses. The Palestinian citizen inhabitants didn't own those houses because they'd been moved from other parts of Jaffa into Ajami in 1948. So they were living in other Palestinian houses as absentees, and the property was controlled by the governmental real estate company Amidar. So then Amidar is able to sell the houses at a profit, and this keeps the kind of the real estate thing going. And it also serves to replace the Palestinian inhabitants of the particular area of Jaffa with whoever can afford the new high property prices, which is Jewish Israelis. I think, and you can read more about this process of tendering for development of municipalities in areas like Nazareth, Haifa, Lid, Akka, Beit Shan. What happened here is that the Israeli custodian for absentee property transferred the properties to a development authority. They were classified as absentee property, and then it's the development authority that makes the choices. And through this goes back to what she was saying about systemic de-development. Through this development process in a hot real estate market, it enables the change of the identity of the inhabitants of these particular areas. I think that covers most of what Basma was saying. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Alexander, for being the interlocutor for Basma here and for adding some context to what she wrote. Muna, I want to give you a chance to respond to some of that or add to it however you see fit, and then we'll open it up to a wider Q&A.
Great, thank you, Alexander and Nora for this. I completely agree with Basma, and kind of also the situation in Sheikh Jarrah kind of raised issues of similar expulsions that are planned for in Jaffa and as Basma has mentioned, in so many other places where Palestinians live. And again, it's what Basma said, I really feel kind of summarizes it really greatly, and the idea of Judaizing space. The fact that your existence, whether in your home, whether on your land, whether anywhere you exist in Palestine, is seen to be as in the settler colonial logic as something temporary. There will be laws and regulations and ways, even where market logic comes in, to say that, oh, your time is done here, and this is when the next type or the next level of dispossession happens. And this is the case in Sheikh Jarrah after the great spotlight on the case. There were of Israeli state officials who claimed that, oh, this is just a real estate dispute. So fact that putting Palestinians in this case in Jerusalem, who are occupied under international law. East Jerusalem is occupied territory, at least if you want to adhere to international law convention. And the fact that basically we don't have even citizenship, right? And kind of putting us, this very marginalized group of Palestinians against a highly funded organization, a politically sanctioned organization of Israeli settlers, who their aim is explicitly to make Jerusalem a Judaized space. And this is kind of supported by the Jerusalem municipality master plans that also kind of confirm the same, saying that there has to be a demographic balance where 70% of Jerusalem are Jewish residents or Jewish inhabitants, and as less as possible of Palestinians. And this is where you see the discrepancy. And again, the fact that citizenship is also another facade of the settler colonial quest for equality and inclusion that Palestinians inside Israel have been witnessing and have known for decades. The fact that, you carry an Israeli citizenship does not give you the same access to rights, and especially that you are considered to be just, at the end of the day, a Palestinian or what they call an Arab. So that also kind of puts you in that precarious condition where your existence, again, is so unsettled, and in a way, this is kind of at the heart and core of settler colonial state. And this is why are framing these issues as one, and not really taking into account, that this is citizens of Israel, and this is a dispute between citizens of Israel, and it's a real estate dispute, and only saying, in occupied territories is different. No, actually, from the river to the sea, again, and this is where this phrase is becoming more and more prominent, not just as a sentimental cry for justice, but an actual concrete cry for justice, because it is that Palestinians, whether doesn't matter their legal the legal identification they have on this land, they're still under systematic dispossession. They're still under precarious conditions. And Alexander mentioned as well what Basma shared about kind of coexistence, and we know that this is a bubble that is bursting. Palestinians knew this already, but I think for the rest of the world and for Israeli citizens who believed for very long of the existence of such coexistence, which is impossible in my view.
Thank you so much, Muna, for those thoughts and for your analysis earlier. So we're going to open up the Q&A. I just want to encourage the participants in our virtual audience to submit their questions in a timely manner, because we are going to finish today at 1 p.m. PST at the top of the hour sharp, since we only have Muna with us for the Q&A. I want to Muna, I want to start with a question that was posed at the panel yesterday that we didn't get to from our colleague Usha Iyer, who I believe is in the audience today here at Stanford. She was asking about how the bombing in Gaza affected men and women differently. So kind of bringing gender into our analysis in a way that hasn't really been done explicitly in any of the panels. And I was really compelled by this. I was compelled by a number of the sort of linguistic ways that you brought together your analysis, both the counter-infrastructure, but also the uneven waterscape. And I wondered if you could comment on that. You could comment on the bombing question specifically if you'd like, but I'm really interested in how the uneven waterscape might affect men and women differently, or how, perhaps how gender has come into your analysis otherwise.
Yeah, I might start actually with my own research, because this is something I also come across, especially when we speak about kind of the aspirations of Palestinian farmers to embrace modernity and kind of take their agriculture, let's say, into a next stage of development. It tends to be Palestinian men who would actually be the ones doing that, while kind of the role of taking care of the land in its most organic and natural way was given to women. So this kind of really started showing up a lot when I did a lot of interviews, and when I met a lot of women farmers on the land in Al Batuf Valley, which is a valley, a Palestinian valley in the Galilee, and the fact that women will have mentioned, that after after 1948 and the Nakba, where a lot of the land was taken away and the men were starting to go into labor, working as laborers, as daily wage laborers to build Israeli settlements and cities. The women were the ones who came back strongly to the land, and they're the ones who kind of took on the burden of keeping the land alive, because this is also part of a kind of a commitment or a stewardship over land in Palestine, where you don't leave land barren. Like you will not leave your land to just be barren, but also on top of that, the fact that it can be also under the threat of confiscation if that case stays for a few years where you don't cultivate your land. But anyways, Palestinian women were the ones who kind of led that. And because of Israeli kind of denial of development in that valley specifically, where a water drainage network was never allowed, Palestinians were actually making claims to be connected to the water network, to actually be part of a more intensive agriculture, but these claims were always stopped and halted. And women today are still the one leading farming on the lands, and they have found different and ingenious ways of actually making profit by making, seasonal markets, growing indigenous crops that people actually from different locations would come to find them. So they are the ones leading, and this has continued with their effort, with their actually role, anyways, traditionally in leading farming work. For Gaza, I would say, just not an expert on gender at all, but definitely we can imagine also the situation in Gaza, which is the highest population of inhabitants per kilometer square. Imagine this condition where you have to live under like in that condition as a woman is anyways very limiting. And imagine now that after witnessing destruction, and even for young women who are working in different sectors like IT and technology, they were mentioning that how the high-rise buildings were their escape point to go into, where a lot of organizations have set office there because they will share a generator and they will have continuous flow of supply of electricity. And people will actually, young men and women, but mostly young women, will actually find it a haven to go into those towers to connect with the world, to develop their ideas and to work on it. So I think definitely, this will have a gendered effect. And the fact that, as well, that we're in the middle of COVID and in the middle of a pandemic that for sure is also disproportionately affecting women. That also adds to the burden. Yeah, and I don't know if I answered this question, but this is what comes to mind.
No, you did. This is not an aspect that I would have thought of in any way. I wanted to just also give you the opportunity to talk a little bit more about this idea of counter-infrastructure that I'm so compelled by, like maybe more specific examples, right, of how sort of what practices you were seeing on the ground that inspired that idea, maybe is one way of putting it.
Yeah, sure. I think it's the idea was behind kind of characterizing the infrastructure of the settler colonial state as this very strong and, as I mentioned before, like impermeable infrastructure that transports, water away from Palestinian communities and transports them for the benefit of Jewish settlement expansion. And the fact that infrastructure, we can actually frame it in that way, but also the lens of infrastructure allows us to think of ways through which indigenous communities throughout Palestine have found ingenious ways of countering that hegemony over infrastructure belonging to the settler. The infrastructure can also be a tool for marginalized communities to counter narratives around water. I would talk about the occupied Golan Heights because this is somewhere where I found that these counter infrastructures have flourished, where the Jawlani farmers managed to, in the middle of the night, build hundreds of circular metallic tanks to capture rainwater, which is under Israeli law off limits. It's illegal to actually, this is under only the state control type of role or it's only allowed for the state to do it. And people have, because they are occupied, and they wanted to counter that kind of domination over natural resources. And they started doing that, cultivating lands and with crops that require water in order to kind of also amplify and raise their claims for reclamation of natural resources. And through that process, the reclamation of natural resources through building this counter infrastructure also had a ripple effect on their political identity and their connections to the land and belonging. So it all kind of connected and amplified different aspects of identity. However, if we look at counter infrastructure, let's say in the Palestinian case, it also is the same, where we can actually harvest rain from carry out rainwater harvesting in areas that are not allowed for you to do that, or where we actually hide pipe networks from the eyes and from the gaze of the settlers who are watching for every development of infrastructure in Palestine. And also, how do we kind of reuse and adapt our traditional methods of capturing water through shallow wells and all sorts of different wells that rely on traditional knowledge and knowledge of the landscape and the contours of the land to capture as much water as possible. And these are great quotidian and really everyday type of infrastructure that maybe will not be highlighted, but are as important as the very dominant settler colonial infrastructure.
Thank you. I want to take a question that we just got from the audience about whether what or if anything you've gotten about thinking about some of these issues comparatively. And this is also inspired by the way Alexander was kind of thinking about Basma's point about segregated mixed cities comparatively with what he sees around us in California. So we have a question from Susan Herring about the way that there's currently a drought in Oregon, and there's a battlefield opening in water rights and use involving both farmers, who she's characterizing here as colonizers, the Klamath Indian tribe, which holds fishing rights to the Dying Reservoir, and conservationists of the state who are trying to preserve the water-dependent wildlife of the region. And she's, seeing direct parallels with what you're describing. And so I just wanted to, ask if that's been useful in your research, or, even potentially, this is something I think a lot about in my own research, if there are pitfalls to making those kinds of comparisons.
No, it's definitely a very, very good question or comment from Susan, because this is how also the development of water in general in the Jordan River Basin, which includes Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and Palestine, kind of followed the model of the Tennessee Valley Authority and other valley authorities in the US, where they brought kind of the technical know-how and the aspiration and imaginaries of what water should do, to these areas. How can we actually harness it and use it to the limits, and I see what she's saying also it's so evident also in the case of Palestine, because this is the case in the Galilee, for instance, where there is now kind of a contention and a battle between Palestinian farmers who have been denied development for so long, and the settlers who now live on the hills overlooking this beautiful valley. So they're actually putting forward a conservation type of argument, saying, oh, actually, we appreciate how the Palestinian farmers have kept this so pristine, and we want to preserve it because it's for the benefit of all, for the environment, we can turn it into an ecotourism spot, and kind of also of course negating and also dismissing Palestinian imaginaries of the place, and the fact that the Galilee is the last kind of stronghold, let's call it, of Palestinians inside Israel. So this kind of also shifting narratives of the settler colonial state and adapting its kind of viewpoint and imaginary of the place always is in fact oppositional to what indigenous people want, and also framing it in terms of like water rights. Again, also in also the contemporary and more kind of modern water rights framing also weakens, other ways of seeing water, because water can be much more than just claiming rights to it, rights of use or access, but it can also, there has spiritual and other values that in the case of Palestine, at least, is usually not even talked about at all. So there's so much to learn from, because this coloniality of water traveled from the US to settler colonial state of Israel, and it continues to travel all around the world.
I think we have time for one more question, and I'm going to try to articulate a combined question. I was really interested, and I think a few people were interested, and I think you watched the panel yesterday, in the discussion around sort of what was constructed as rural versus urban mobilization. And I feel like your intervention around what we see as mobilization is so important for thinking about that sort of construction of the rural and the urban. And so I was wondering if you could comment on that a little bit, but also maybe connected to the previous question, how you see these modes of counter infrastructure possibly spilling over into other mobilizations, right? Possibly outside of the Palestinian context, right? Inspiring other mobilizations more transnationally, whether you see that happening or whether you see there's potential for that in the specific kind of movements that you're looking at.
Yeah, sure. I caught a bit of the discussion yesterday, and also had comments about it, because I think while a lot of the mobilization might have had kind of their platforms in more urban settings, but they always started from rural areas. And I think these are narratives that are usually kind of, again, put aside because of class issues and other issues that kind of take over. But I wanted to highlight that in the Galilee in 1976, it was the Land Day, actually, which is considered to be, another uprising that even superseded the first Intifada, was actually on the lands of Sakhnin, Arabi, and Deir Hanna. So in the heart of the Galilee, in the heart of agricultural land in the Galilee, where there was a plan to actually confiscate thousands of dunam of land. And this is what spurred actually Land Day, that became such a monumental event for all Palestinians. Again, it starts in different geographical locations and spreads, but it starts in the rural areas. And I wanted to also connect what happened in Palestine to what happened in the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, for instance, where after 1967, Palestinians and Jawlani Syrians actually would convene and talk about, the realities of living under occupation, and how can legal advice, they would give legal advice to each other about how to counter confiscation, for instance, how to protect the land. And a lot of the strategies that were used on Land Day would travel to the Golan Heights when in their strike in 1982, that was a 6-month strike, also to protest against forced citizenship. And that's another maybe topic, but all of these kind of movements had at its heart land and natural resources, not based on territorial claims of those resources, but rather how land, water, and other natural sources actually, in conditions of settler colonial rule, actually provide a sense of belonging and a quest for belonging that beyond nation state aspirations, I think, in my view. So I think that these events will eventually be around land and natural resources, and will eventually maybe they will start in rural areas, but they might also have ripple effects everywhere else. And I think it's definitely time, and there's been a lot of cases of learning and solidarity and collaboration with other cases of indigenous people struggle for land and water that we can still build on, and we can learn from. There were historical collaborations that happened in the past, but I think now as well, with a lot of issues arising, especially in North America, but other places also, that there's so much potential, because again, the settler colonial logic is the same, and the ways we can counter it are numerous, and we need to kind of build more alliances and learn more from each other.
Muna, I just want to thank you so much for your time. I know this was not the best time for you, and we're really grateful that you participated. And I'm just going to take this opportunity to thank all of the panelists again in our 3-panel series, and also to thank Basma for participating asynchronously. And thank you again to all the organizers and to the Abbasi program and to our audience, and wishing everybody a good afternoon and a just future.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Noura, and everyone for organizing it.